stop scrolling just for a second. Because what you're about to read isn't a motivational pep talk. It isn't a list of 5 habits successful people do before breakfast. And it definitely isn't another piece of content telling you to believe in yourself and watch the magic happen. This is something older, something that has been sitting in the architecture of human thought for over 1,500 years, waiting, and I mean waiting, for the exact moment when someone exhausted enough, honest enough, and brave enough would finally be ready to hear it. That person might be you right now. Here's what nobody tells you about the moments that change your life. They rarely look like opportunities. They look like endings. They look like the morning you wake up and realize the life you built doesn't feel like yours anymore. They look like the text message that rewrites everything, the doctor's appointment that splits your timeline into before and after, the Monday morning when you show up to a job that used to mean something and feel absolutely nothing. And here's the thing that makes this teaching dangerous, genuinely, productively dangerous, to every comfortable assumption you've been carrying. The fall was always part of the design, not as punishment, not as evidence that you did something wrong, not as proof that the universe is indifferent to your suffering, as curriculum. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start where every real conversation starts, with the thing nobody wants to say out loud. Introduction, the wheel you're already on. Right now, somewhere in your life, something is turning. You might not feel it yet. Maybe things are actually going well. The relationship is solid. The bank account is breathing. The future feels like a path rather than a fog. In those seasons, it's easy to believe you've finally figured something out, that the turbulence is behind you, that you've earned a kind of stability that other people just haven't worked hard enough to reach. And then the call comes, the contract ends. The person you thought was permanent isn't. The health you took for granted starts sending signals you can't ignore. Or, just as unexpectedly, just as completely, a door you never noticed before swings open and your entire life rearranges itself around a possibility you didn't plan for. This is the Wheel of Fortune, not the game show, not the tarot card, the actual ancient bone-deep idea that has threaded itself through every wisdom tradition in human history. Because every wisdom tradition in human history noticed the same thing. Life moves in cycles, and the position you occupy today is never the position you'll occupy forever. More than 1,500 years ago, a man named Boethius, a philosopher, a senator, a man of extraordinary privilege and influence in the late Roman world, found himself sitting in a prison cell, waiting for a death sentence handed down by the very king he had served faithfully for decades. In that cell, stripped of everything he had spent his life accumulating, his title, his wealth, his reputation, his freedom, he began to write. He didn't write a survival manual. He didn't write a revenge fantasy. He didn't write a bitter account of the people who had wronged him. He wrote about why. Why do human beings pour so much of their identity into things that can be taken away? Why, when life is good, do we quietly begin to believe it will stay that way? And why, when it falls apart, do we become equally convinced that the falling apart is permanent? His answer became one of the most read books in Western history for over 1,000 years, The Consolation of Philosophy, and the central image it gave us, the Wheel of Fortune, has been showing up in architecture, literature, philosophy, and psychology ever since, because it keeps being true. But here's what I want to do with that ancient idea in this piece of writing. I don't want to deliver it to you as a history lesson. I want to deliver it as a mirror. Because the wheel isn't a medieval metaphor. It's your life, right now, in the specific turn you're currently navigating. And the teaching encoded inside this ancient image has the potential to completely reorganize your relationship to everything that has ever felt like a loss, a setback, a failure, or an ending. That reorganization is what I mean when I call this dangerous. Not dangerous in the way sharp objects are dangerous. Dangerous in the way that real truth is dangerous, because once you actually absorb it, you cannot go back to the version of yourself that hadn't heard it yet. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Wheel That Never Stops. And why that's actually good news. Here's the first uncomfortable thing I need you to sit with. The wheel doesn't stop for anyone, not for you. Not for the most successful person you know. Not for the kings and empires and civilizations that have risen and fallen across thousands of years of human history. Not for the wisest, most spiritually developed, most deeply good person who has ever lived. The wheel turns. That's what wheels do. And here's the thing. For most of your life, you've probably experienced this as a threat. The awareness, sitting somewhere underneath the good moments, that this won't last. The low hum of anxiety that accompanies genuine happiness, because happiness, you've learned, tends to be temporary. The way you hold joy a little at arm's length sometimes, as if getting too close to it might make it flinch. That anxiety makes sense. It's not irrational. You have lived long enough to know that things change. People leave. Circumstances shift. The position you worked so hard to reach has a way of revealing new problems once you're standing inside it. But here's where the ancient teaching, and I mean ancient, I'm talking Boethius in 523 A.D., the Buddhist wheel of becoming carved into temple walls, the Norse concept of weird, the Hindu idea of samsara. Here's where every single one of these traditions agrees on something that our modern self-help culture almost never says clearly enough. The turning is not a malfunction. The turning is the entire function. Think about what a world without the wheel would actually feel like. If every gain were permanent, gain would carry no weight. If every loss were final, there would be no recovery. If every position were fixed forever, effort would be meaningless. Because effort only matters in a landscape where things can actually change. A universe without the wheel wouldn't be paradise. It would be a kind of stasis indistinguishable from death. Nothing at stake, nothing to strive toward, nothing to protect, nothing to grieve, and therefore, this is the part the records and the traditions agree on, nothing to learn. The wheel turns because a universe that didn't turn would teach nothing at all. Now, I know that might land as abstract. So let me make it personal. Think about the hardest turn your wheel has made so far, the one that, in the moment, felt least survivable. The loss, the ending, the dismantling of something you'd built your sense of yourself around. Maybe it was a relationship that defined you for years and then didn't. Maybe it was a career you'd sacrificed for and then lost in a way that felt like humiliation. Maybe it was something quieter, a version of yourself you were proud of, slowly becoming unrecognizable. Now ask yourself honestly, who are you because of that turn? Not who you became despite it, not who you managed to rebuild yourself into after recovering from it, but who are you because it happened, because The specific thing it forced you to confront, the specific layer of yourself it uncovered, the specific clarity it left you with when everything else was stripped away. I'm not asking you to be grateful for pain you haven't processed. That's cheap. That's what people who haven't really suffered say to people who have. I'm asking something harder. Is it possible that the turning, however brutal it felt, was doing something for you that the staying couldn't have done? Because that's what Boethius concluded from a death cell, with no incentive to be optimistic. The wheel turns because staying still would teach the soul nothing, and the specific turns your wheel has made, the specific curriculum of rises and falls you've lived through, those weren't random. They were yours. Here's where the teaching gets genuinely useful for your actual daily life. There's a mistake almost everyone makes when they're at the top of their wheel. When things are going well, when they've reached some summit they work toward, the mistake is settling into the top as though it's a destination rather than a position. And there's an equal and opposite mistake almost everyone makes at the bottom. When things have fallen apart, when they're in the cell, when the grief is real and the loss is undeniable. That mistake is treating the bottom as though it's permanent. The wheel answers both of these mistakes in exactly the same way. No, that's not where you stay. The same law that brought you down will bring you around. The same movement that took something from you will, in its own time and its own order, bring something new into your life. Not as a replacement necessarily, not as a consolation prize, but as the next chapter, the one you couldn't have written from where you were before. This isn't toxic positivity. I'm not telling you that everything happens for a reason in that breezy, unbothered way that dismisses real suffering. I'm telling you something more specific and more demanding. The position is never permanent, and your job is not to freeze the wheel. Your job is to change your relationship to the turning. That shift from trying to freeze the wheel to learning to work with the turning is what the next 7 chapters are about. And it starts with understanding what you've been reaching for every time you climb toward a summit, and why it's been leaving you emptier than you expected once you got there. Chapter 2. The 4 things you thought would fix you, and why they didn't. There's a question that cuts straight to the center of this teaching, and I want to ask it directly because I think you already know the answer. If money, status, achievement, and pleasure were actually capable of making you feel complete, why hasn't the version of them you've already had done it yet? This isn't a rhetorical trick. It's a diagnostic. Because here's what I've noticed, and I guess you've noticed too in your quieter moments. The things you work hardest to acquire have a strange habit of revealing a new layer of incompleteness once you've acquired them. The promotion you wanted so badly becomes the anxiety of keeping the promotion. The relationship you thought would settle something inside you reveals new uncertainties instead. The number in your bank account that was supposed to feel like security feels instead like a more sophisticated version of the same old fear. Boethius noticed this too. From his prison cell, looking back at everything he'd accumulated and lost, he observed something almost mathematically strange. The very things he had believed would make him secure had, in fact, been the source of his most elaborate anxieties. The more he had to lose, the more energy he'd spent on the fear of losing it. This is not a problem unique to ancient Roman philosophers. The ancient wisdom traditions from Stoic philosophy to Vedic teaching to Buddhist psychology, all independently catalog the same four things that human beings consistently mistake for the source of their completeness. They use different words for them across different centuries and different continents, but they're describing the same four counterfeits: wealth, status, power, pleasure. And before you roll your eyes at a list that sounds like it belongs in a self-denial lecture from a monastery, I want to be really clear about something. None of these four things are bad. The teaching is not that money is evil, or that ambition is corrupt, or that you're supposed to live in joyless asceticism to prove your spiritual credentials. The teaching is something considerably more precise and considerably harder to practice. These four things become problems, become the specific mechanism by which the wheel harms you rather than simply turns, when you mistake them for the location of your own worth. Let's take them one at a time. Wealth is the first and most obvious one because it's the one we're most socially rewarded for chasing. And there's something almost paradoxical about the nature of money that Boethius points out with surprising clarity for a man writing 15 centuries before behavioral economics. Money is defined entirely by its capacity to be spent. A coin that is never spent has never fulfilled its function as wealth. The very nature of the object is that it must leave you to have meant anything. You cannot accumulate your way to security, because security was never the nature of the object you were accumulating. This is why, and you may have seen this in your own life or in the lives of people around you, more money rarely produces the peace you expected it to. What it tends to produce instead is a more expensive and elaborate version of the same anxiety. The fear of loss, now upgraded in direct proportion to how much there is to lose. There's a specific pattern that emerges when someone builds their entire identity around accumulated wealth. When the wheel turns through market collapse, through unexpected circumstances, through any of the 1,000 ways that money leaves, the experience isn't of losing an object. It's of losing a self. Because over time, the identity had fused so completely with the account balance that the person could no longer distinguish between having money and being someone. That fusion isn't natural, it's learned. And because it's learned, it can be unlearned. But the unlearning usually requires the wheel to do the separation by force first. Status is the second counterfeit treasure, and in many ways it's the most seductive. Because, unlike wealth, it feels weightless. It seems to cost nothing to acquire and nothing to hold. But here's what Boethius observed, writing from a position of destroyed reputation. Your status exists entirely in the minds of other people. It is not a possession in any real sense. It is a belief held by strangers, subject to their attention, their memory, their mood, their shifting priorities. Fame, he writes, cannot even reliably cross the borders of a single country in a single lifetime, let alone survive the erosion of centuries. Every celebrated name is eventually forgotten by everyone. Now think about what that means for the way you make decisions. How many choices have you made? How many things have you said, worn, shared, avoided, pretended, performed, in the service of a reputation that lives entirely in the judgments of people who are themselves navigating their own insecurities? When someone anchors their sense of worth to external reputation, they hand the authorship of their own value to a rotating cast of other people, many of whom are themselves lost, chasing their own counterfeits, in no position to accurately determine anyone's worth. When the crowd turns, and crowds turn, that's what crowds do, the injury is catastrophic precisely because the person handed away the very organ that was supposed to determine their own value. Power is the third counterfeit and the most dangerous one. It's because power does something uniquely distorting to the soul that holds it. It convinces you that you finally escaped the wheel, that you're no longer subject to fortune's turns, that you become capable of directing fortune for other people. No soul in any recorded moment of history who accumulated power as their primary strategy for security ever actually escaped the wheel. If anything, power accelerates the turning, because the higher you climb, using power as your ladder, the further there is to fall, and the wheel does not make exceptions for those who believe themselves exempt. The higher you go, the more exposed you become, and the more exposed you become, the more energy you pour into defending the position rather than actually living from it. Pleasure is the fourth counterfeit, and it receives the sharpest treatment in the ancient teaching, because pleasure is uniquely designed to consume itself in the very act of being obtained. The moment you reach the pleasure you were pursuing, the pleasure begins to end, and the hunger for the next pleasure quietly begins. This creates what I'd call a hamster wheel. Inside the larger wheel, a faster, smaller cycle of craving and satisfaction and renewed craving that keeps you in constant motion while creating the illusion that you're standing still in contentment. Every pleasure, by its nature, ends, and a life built on a sequence of endings is a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of suffering, but the exhaustion of a hunger that eating only ever sharpens. Now, and this is where I need you to stay with me. Here's the thing that none of this means. It doesn't mean refuse wealth. It doesn't mean abandon ambition. It doesn't mean live in cheerless detachment from the sensory world, treating enjoyment as a spiritual failure. What both Boethius and the deepest wisdom traditions actually teach is this: these four things may be held, may even be deeply enjoyed, so long as you don't mistake them for the location of your own worth. A person who understands that their worth doesn't live in their bank account can lose that bank account and remain, in every meaningful sense, exactly who they were before. A person who understands that their worth doesn't live in their title can be stripped of every credential they hold and walk away, not unaffected, not pretending the loss doesn't sting, but undiminished. This isn't theoretical. This is an observable, repeatable pattern across the lives of people who have survived catastrophic reversals and emerged from them somehow more whole than before, precisely because the false good was the only thing removed. The true good, whatever was actually real about them, was never at risk. So the question becomes, what is actually real about you? That's the question the next chapter is designed to help you answer. Chapter 3, The Record Beneath Everything That Happens to You. Here's a frame I want to offer you, not as metaphysics you have to believe in, but as a genuinely useful lens for understanding your own life. Imagine that everything that happens to you on the wheel, every rise, every fall, every summit, every pit, gets transferred in real time to a second layer of your experience, a layer that doesn't rise and doesn't fall, a layer that doesn't have a top or a bottom, a winning season or a losing one, a layer that simply records not what happened to you, but how you met what happened to you. This is the distinction that changes everything, and it's the one that's most consistently overlooked in the way we talk about personal development, because we spend an enormous amount of energy focused on the events of our lives. What happened, what we lost, what we gained, what we were given, what was taken. We build our narratives around the external events. We explain ourselves through the circumstances. I became this way because of that. I couldn't do that because of this. I was given these advantages. I was dealt this hand. And all of that is real. The events are real. The circumstances genuinely shape things. But here's what the Wheel of Fortune teaching has been saying across 15 centuries. The events themselves are morally neutral. The wheel doesn't care whether you learned humility from your fall or simply became bitter. It doesn't have a preference. It doesn't track your response. Only you track your response. And the tracking happens at that second layer, the record beneath the wheel. Think about two people going through the same category of loss. Let's say a business collapse. Years of work, identity, financial security, all of it gone in a relatively short window. Same external event, same wheel turn. Person A responds with despair, blame, and the persistent belief that they were specifically targeted by bad luck or the malice of others. They spend the next several years defending the narrative that what happened was someone else's fault, and that the version of themselves that existed before the collapse was the real them, unfairly interrupted. Person B responds with grief, genuine, honest, ugly grief, followed eventually by reflection. They ask hard questions about what the collapse revealed. They find beneath the rubble some beliefs about themselves they'd never been forced to examine because the business had been answering those questions for them. They build something different, not better necessarily, different, built on a foundation they now understand more clearly because they've seen what a foundation looks like when it fails. Same turn of the wheel, completely different records, and the records don't disappear. They accumulate, they compound, they shape the quality of consciousness you bring to the next turn, and the turn after that. This is what karma actually means, stripped of the cosmic punishment and reward framework that popular culture has attached to it. It's not a ledger of good deeds and bad deeds being tallied by an external scorekeeper. It's the literal structural development of your own capacity to meet the wheel with wisdom rather than terror. A person who has practiced across years, across difficult turns, meeting loss with honesty rather than denial, with reflection rather than blame, with curiosity rather than bitterness, doesn't receive some external reward for their practice. They simply become someone who is genuinely less destabilized by loss. The way a body that has trained consistently doesn't receive a prize for its effort. It simply becomes stronger, and that strength is available in every future moment that demands it. This reframes the purpose of every difficult turn you've navigated. It wasn't just something that happened to you, it was curriculum. It was the specific, personalized, non-transferable lesson that your particular combination of history, patterns, and unexamined beliefs needed to encounter. And whether you extracted the lesson or bypassed it, whether you integrated it or just survived it, that's the record. That's what you carry forward. Here's the uncomfortable corollary. The fastest route through any difficult lesson is not around the pain, but through it, not wallowing in it indefinitely, not turning suffering into an identity, but honest, full contact presence with what's actually happening, followed by genuine reflection, followed eventually by integration. Shortcuts through this process don't actually shorten the process. They schedule a repeat. If you look at your own history honestly, really honestly, you can probably identify at least one or two themes that have shown up in different costumes across different chapters of your life. The same dynamic appearing in different relationships. The same pattern of self-sabotage wearing different circumstances. The same category of loss arriving again after you thought you'd moved past it. That's not bad luck. That's the curriculum being patient with you. And the moment you actually meet the lesson, fully, honestly, without flinching, is the moment you stop needing it to show up again. This is the record beneath everything that happens to you, not the events, the responses, not the turns of the wheel, the quality of presence you brought to each turn. That's the thing the wheel can't take from you. Chapter 4. The voice that speaks when everything goes quiet. I want to talk about something that happens in the deepest moments of the wheel's descent. Something that I suspect you may have experienced. Maybe without having a framework for it. Maybe without being able to explain it to someone else without it sounding strange. When everything that normally defines you goes quiet. When the roles you play, the titles you hold, the relationships that anchor your sense of self are temporarily stripped away or genuinely lost. Something else becomes audible. A different kind of knowing. A different quality of intelligence. Boethius described it as a figure appearing at his bedside. A woman of extraordinary presence whose eyes seemed to see through rather than simply at him. He called her Lady Philosophy. He described her first act not as comfort, but as correction, chasing away the voices in his head that were feeding his self-pity, calling them false comforters who were poisoning him with the sweetness of despair rather than healing him with truth. And then she began to ask him questions. What is a human being, actually? What does a good life consist of? What is the nature of genuine happiness? Not the feeling, but the architecture of it. And Boethius, to his own frustration, found he couldn't answer clearly anymore, not because he'd never known, but because his grief had clouded his access to a knowledge he'd always possessed, a knowledge the grief had temporarily buried. This is what I mean when I say the voice in the dark cell is a native, not a visitor. It's not new information arriving from outside you. It's old, buried knowledge being uncovered from within. It's the part of you that has always known, underneath all the accumulation of external identity, underneath all the noise of who you're supposed to be according to every external measure, who you actually are. And here's what every wisdom tradition that has recorded this experience agrees on. This voice does not tend to arrive at the summit. It doesn't show up in the seasons of ease and confidence when the ego is loud and satisfied and has no need to listen. It arrives in the cell, in the collapse, in the 3 a.m. moment when there's nothing left to distract you from yourself. This is not cruelty. It's timing. It's the only timing in which the signal can actually break through the noise. Think about your own version of that moment. Maybe you're in it right now. Maybe you're remembering one from years ago. The moment when the life you'd built stopped working in the way it used to work, and in the sudden silence, something underneath the noise became briefly, startlingly clear. a sense of direction you hadn't expected, a clarity about what actually mattered, not in the abstract, but in the specific, lived, this is what I'm here for sense. A feeling of recognition, as though a truth that had been sitting patiently beneath the surface of your regular life was now, finally, impossible to ignore. That's the voice. And here's what matters most about how it speaks. It doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It doesn't promise the wheel will stop turning. It doesn't offer a deal. Do these things and your suffering will end. It doesn't manufacture comfort out of nothing. What it does is help you remember something you knew before you forgot it. That the wheel was never you. That the thing capable of asking these questions in the dark. The thing capable of listening to that deeper signal at all was never on the wheel to begin with. In the Buddhist tradition, this presence is called the witness, the awareness that observes every state you pass through without itself being permanently altered by any of them. In the Vedic tradition, it's the Atman, the true self, distinguishable from the small, frightened ego. Precisely at the moment, the ego can no longer sustain its own performance. The Christian mystics called it the inner light. Edgar Cayce, describing his own experiences of deep inner knowing, spoke of it as remembering rather than receiving, accessing something the soul had never actually forgotten, only buried beneath the noise of ordinary life. Different traditions, different language, same report. And here's the practical implication that matters most for your actual life right now. Your task, when you're in your version of the dark cell, is not to perform a peace you don't yet feel. It's not to rush yourself toward enlightenment on an accelerated timeline because you find suffering uncomfortable. It's not to spiritually bypass the grief by reframing yourself into something that looks like wisdom from the outside, but is actually just numbing. Your task is honesty. Honest grief, honestly examined, without the added burden of believing the grief itself means something has gone fundamentally, permanently wrong. The wheel turning is not a malfunction. Your pain in response to it is not a malfunction. Both are simply the mechanism through which the deeper voice eventually becomes audible. And when it does become audible, in whatever form it takes for you, because it rarely arrives wearing white robes with a philosophy degree, it will do something specific. It will ask you to distinguish between the position you're currently occupying on the wheel and the identity you've been carrying underneath every position. That distinction is the entire teaching. And the next chapter is about why understanding it intellectually is only the first step. Because the law that makes it true is far deeper than any single life's experience. Chapter 5. The law that governs everything and why fighting it is costing you. There is a law so fundamental to the structure of reality that it's rarely stated outright. The way a library never posts a sign explaining that its books are made of paper. It's simply the medium in which every other experience operates. The law is this: nothing that has a beginning is exempt from having an end, and nothing that occupies a position can occupy it permanently. This is impermanence, not as a Buddhist technicality, not as a philosophy lecture, as the actual working grammar of every experience you will ever have. Boethius builds toward this law through pure reason, and it's worth watching the logic because it closes a trap that most of us have been living inside without realizing it. He asks, what would it actually mean for fortune to behave consistently? To lift someone and leave them at the summit permanently? His conclusion, that's not a coherent request, because fortune, by which he means the principle of change, the turning quality of circumstances, is defined by change. Asking it to stop changing is asking it to stop being what it is. It's roughly equivalent to asking water to stay wet while simultaneously stopping being water. The turning is not something fortune does to you occasionally. The turning is the entirety of what fortune is. To resent the wheel for turning is, in the strictest sense, to resent it for existing at all. And that request, the request to simply not exist, is one the universe has never once granted to anyone, at any level of virtue, power, or cleverness. Now here's where the teaching gets genuinely interesting, because every major wisdom tradition takes this same observation and does something with it beyond just, that's how things are. Deal with it. The Buddhist concept of anicca, impermanence, isn't just a description of reality. It's offered as a liberation. Once you genuinely internalize that nothing conditioned is permanent, you stop the exhausting project of trying to freeze what's moving. You stop pouring energy into the impossible task of keeping things exactly as they are, and start directing that energy towards something actually available, full presence in what is. The Stoic philosophers of Rome, writing in the same tradition that shaped Boethius, practiced a daily reminder, everything I hold is on loan, borrowed for a season, due to be returned. They didn't do this to be morbid. They did it because they discovered that the awareness of impermanence, far from stealing joy, actually intensifies it. You can't fully enjoy something you're treating as permanent, because permanence creates entitlement, and entitlement creates numbness. But when you hold something with the knowledge that it's temporary, this meal, this conversation, this season, this body, this love, the temporariness sharpens your attention to it in a way that permanent things simply can't. The Vedic sages folded the same law into the very structure of cosmic time itself, teaching that even the universe breathes in cycles of creation and dissolution, vast enough to make a single human lifetime look like a single candle flame. You are living right now inside the law all of these traditions were describing. Nothing that has arrived in your life arrived to stay. Not the good things, not the difficult things, not the relationships, not the achievements, not the struggles, not the confusion. Everything that is currently here is currently passing through. Now, before you read that as depressing, I need you to sit with what the alternative would actually feel like. Imagine a version of your life where nothing changed, where the relationship you were in at 22 was a relationship you were still in at 50, where the understanding you had of yourself at the beginning of your adult life was the understanding you still had at its middle, where the opportunities that existed in your early 20s were the same ones that existed in your late 40s, where the mistakes you made in your first decade were the defining narrative of your entire existence, with no possibility of revision. That is the world without the wheel. And it's not paradise. It's a cage. The turning isn't the enemy. The turning is what makes growth even possible. Here's the part that I think gets undersold in most conversations about impermanence. The law applies equally to the difficult things. The pain doesn't stay either. The confusion doesn't stay. The grief doesn't stay. The season of feeling lost, of not knowing who you are or what you're building or whether any of it matters, that doesn't stay either. The same law that took something you loved is the law that will move you through the loss. The same wheel that brought you to the bottom is the wheel that, given time and given your honest engagement with the curriculum, will bring you round. This is not toxic positivity. It's not just think positive and it'll get better. It's the actual structural reality of how experience works, confirmed independently across 15 centuries of human wisdom, across cultures that had no contact with each other, because they were all watching the same wheel. There's one more nuance to the law of impermanence worth naming here, because it has direct practical consequences for how you navigate the wheel in real time. The wheel very rarely turns suddenly. What feels sudden is usually the noticing, the moment when a shift that has been accumulating for a long time finally crosses a threshold where you can no longer ignore it. A relationship that ends out of nowhere usually had signals, quiet, small, easy to explain away, for months or years before the ending arrived. A career that collapsed unexpectedly usually had warning tremors, a growing mismatch between what the work demanded and what you had to give, or what you needed and what the work was providing. A health situation that came from nowhere usually had a trail of smaller signals you hadn't learned to read yet. Learning to live from the center, from the stillness inside rather than the position on the rim, doesn't give you the power to stop the wheel. But it does give you something almost as valuable, the capacity to notice the turning as it begins, rather than only once it's already thrown you. And that noticing, that quality of honest, grounded, non-defensive attention to the actual signals of your actual life, is one of the most practical skills this teaching has to offer. Chapter 6. What history's greatest falls teach you about your own. If you want to see the total indifference of the wheel to human greatness illustrated on the largest possible canvas, you don't need philosophy. You need history. Because history is, in the most straightforward sense, a record of the wheel in action at civilizational scale. And it tells the same story every single time, without exception, regardless of how powerful the empire, how wise the ruler, or how impressive the accomplishment. Consider what Boethius himself was witnessing from his prison cell in 523 A.D. He was watching the slow-motion dissolution of the last remnants of the Western Roman Empire, an institution so dominant at its height that its citizens would have found the concept of its collapse as difficult to take seriously as most of us find the concept of our own mortality. A civilization that had produced the most sophisticated legal system, the most advanced engineering, and the most extensive administrative infrastructure the Western world had ever seen, dissolving so completely that within a few centuries, the very knowledge required to build Roman aqueducts had been lost across most of Europe, not to be recovered for 1,000 years. The wheel turned on an entire civilization's worth of accumulated achievement. But here's what's more instructive than the collapse itself: how the collapse happened, and specifically the pattern that precedes it, because this pattern recurs with such consistency across every fallen empire that it functions as something close to a physical law. It starts with genuine achievement. A leader, an institution, an organization rises through real skill, real vision, sometimes real virtue. The rise is earned. The summit, for a while, is deserved. Then something shifts. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the leader or institution begins to attribute the achievement not to the temporary and fortunate alignment of talent, timing, and circumstances, but to some permanent, personal quality that has elevated them beyond the ordinary rules that govern everyone else. This shift is rarely conscious, but it shows up reliably in what follows: the gradual elimination of honest counsel, the increasing intolerance for any voice capable of delivering unwelcome truth, the slow replacement of competent critical advisors with people who confirm rather than challenge. Boethius himself was exactly this kind of uncomfortable truth-teller, a man who continued to defend the rights of the Senate even as the political winds around the court shifted decisively against such defense. His removal from favor, followed swiftly by imprisonment and execution, fits precisely into the broader pattern. A summit increasingly intolerant of the honesty that helped build it, and increasingly vulnerable as a direct result. The crown, in other words, doesn't attract the wheel's attention. The belief that the crown makes you exempt from the wheel is what attracts it. Now, this is not a lesson about ancient kings. This is a lesson the wheel applies with equal weight to any position of relative summit. A successful business, a season of public recognition, a period of unusual clarity and confidence, a relationship in which you've become accustomed to being the one who sets the terms. The specific warning encoded in this pattern: success that convinces you that you've become permanently exempt from the ordinary vulnerabilities of other people is the precise condition under which the wheel's next turn tends to arrive with the greatest force and least warning. I want to be precise here because I don't want this to land as success is dangerous, stay small. That's not the teaching. The teaching is this: stay capable of hearing what you'd rather not. Maintain, deliberately and actively, at least one voice in your life willing to tell you something uncomfortable, and preserve the discipline of actually listening to it when it arrives. Every fallen empire in the historical record and every genuinely derailed personal life share a single trait in the final chapter of their ascent. They became, by the end, deaf. The feedback loops that might have caught the warning signs were one by one removed or ignored or drowned out by voices confirming what the summit wanted to hear. Ask yourself honestly, in whatever summit you currently occupy, whatever success, whatever confidence, whatever season of things going your way you're currently navigating, are you still capable of hearing what you would rather not? Not in theory, in practice. Is there an actual person, an actual relationship, an actual discipline in your life that regularly delivers uncomfortable truth? And are you actually letting it reach you? Because the wheel is coming, not as a threat, as a fact. And the only variable is whether it arrives finding you grounded and honest and capable of adapting, or whether it arrives finding you convinced you'd found the loophole. There's a counterpoint worth naming before we leave this chapter, because it prevents the teaching from tipping into pure fatalism about success. Not every leader in history met their end in bitterness or collapse. Some, having built real and lasting good with the position the wheel had lent them, met its eventual turning through age, through natural transition, through the simple passage of time, with something closer to settledness. What distinguished these rarer figures wasn't a different outcome. The wheel took their positions too eventually, as it takes every position. What differed was the relationship they had cultivated across their years at the summit between their identity and their role. Those who had, even while fully inhabiting their position, quietly maintained some portion of themselves that was not the position. A friendship untouched by their status. A practice of reflection disconnected from their public role. A private, imperfect, but genuine understanding that the role was something they did, not something they were. Those people tended to release it when the time came with considerably less anguish, not because the letting go wasn't real, but because the self doing the letting go had never been completely inside the thing being let go of. That distinction between what you do and what you are is at the heart of the final two chapters. Chapter 7. The Good That the Wheel Cannot Touch. We have now spent 6 chapters establishing from every angle available what happiness is not. It is not wealth, which must be spent to have meant anything, and cannot be held without generating fear of its loss. It is not status, which exists entirely in the fickle memory of others and dissolves eventually into the same forgetting that swallowed even the most celebrated names in history. It is not power, which multiplies the height of the eventual fall in exact proportion to how far it lifted you, and which tends, given enough time, to deafen even the wisest person to the very counsel that might have preserved it. It is not pleasure, which consumes itself in the moment of its own satisfaction and leaves behind only a renewed and slightly sharpened hunger. Boethius, having methodically dismantled each of these false goods across his dialogue with philosophy, arrives at the question underneath all of them. If none of this constitutes the true good, does a true good even exist? Or has this entire exercise simply proven that happiness is a promise the universe makes and never keeps? This is the question every honest person eventually arrives at after they've tried enough of the counterfeits and found each one wanting. It's the 3 a.m. question. The question underneath the question when you ask, is this all there is? What you're actually asking is there anything real here? Is there anything that doesn't eventually turn out to be another version of the same disappointment? Philosophy's answer, and the answer encoded across every wisdom tradition that has independently arrived at this territory, is the turn from diagnosis to genuine hope. It begins with an observation that sounds almost embarrassingly obvious until you actually sit with it. Every single false good is chased because it's believed to lead somewhere. Nobody wants money for the paper and metal itself. They want the security, the freedom, the breathing room they believe money will purchase. Nobody wants status for the abstract fact of other people's opinions. They want the sense of worth, the belonging, the significance they believe status will confirm. In other words, every false good is a distorted, partial, imperfect pursuit of something else, some genuine underlying value that the false good only imitates, incompletely, temporarily, with diminishing returns: security, freedom, worth, belonging, significance, delight. These are not illusions. These are real. They are genuine and legitimate longings, not weaknesses to be overcome, but evidence of something your soul actually knows it needs. The error was never in wanting them. The error was in believing that wealth, status, power, and pleasure were the reliable route to obtaining them. The 4 false goods are not evil substitutes for a non-existent true good. They are broken maps to a real destination, and once you understand that, once you see clearly that what you've been chasing wasn't wrong, only the route was wrong, the question becomes, where is the destination actually located? Here's what Boethius concludes, through the most careful philosophical reasoning he could muster in a death cell. The highest good is not a thing you acquire. It is not a position you reach. It is not a state of external circumstances you finally arrange correctly. It is something he describes, through the philosophical vocabulary available to him, as the very ground of being itself, the single source from which all partial goods derive whatever genuine value they actually possess. The way individual rays of light derive their brightness from a single sun they did not generate themselves. The wisdom traditions across every culture and century that have independently arrived at this territory describe the same destination with different language. The Vedic seers called it Brahman, the single unchanging reality underlying every changing appearance, and taught that the individual self was never actually separate from it, only mistaken about its own boundaries. The Buddhist tradition, careful about language that might suggest something to be grasped, called it Buddha nature, the awakened quality already present in every being, requiring not acquisition, but recognition. The Hermetic tradition called it the All, teaching that the entire visible universe existed within the mind of this single source, the way a thought exists within. The mind that thinks it. You don't have to choose between these traditions to receive their common testimony. Every one of them independently arrived at the same report. What you're looking for is not missing. It is only unrecognized. Now here's where this teaching becomes simultaneously more demanding and more freeing than any of the false goods it's describing. This highest good, this source, this underlying reality, whatever vocabulary fits your own framework, is not described as an external destination to reach at the end of a long spiritual journey, the way you'd travel toward a city you've never visited. It is described as the soul's actual and permanent nature, present and complete within you at every moment, in every season, on every position of the wheel, obscured not by distance, but by forgetting. You are not traveling toward the highest good. You are uncovering a highest good you have never actually been without. Think of it this way. Imagine someone emerging from a long illness, perhaps months of fever and disorientation, and the complete subjugation of their ordinary life to the demands of the sickness. As they recover, what they discover is not a new health arriving from somewhere external. They discover the health that was always underneath, present throughout the illness, temporarily obscured by it, waiting with complete patience to be accessible again. The wheel does not exist to torment you. It exists to exhaust, turn by turn, every false route you might otherwise take toward what you're actually seeking, until you've tried wealth and found it insufficient, tried status and watched it dissolve, tried power and felt its isolating weight, tried pleasure and felt its endless renewed hunger, until, having tried everything available on the circumference of the wheel, you finally turn your attention toward the one location you hadn't thought to look, not outward, toward some future position on the wheel, but inward, toward the center, toward the axle that was never moving at all. The world does not change at the moment of this recognition. The wheel does not stop turning. But the soul's relationship to the turning changes completely, because it is no longer searching the wheel itself for the thing it needed all along, having finally recognized that the thing it needed was never on the wheel to find. Boethius reaches this in the final pages of his work, still imprisoned, still facing execution, which arrives shortly after he sets down his pen. Nothing about his external circumstances improved as a result of his philosophical journey, and yet the person writing the final chapter is recognizably at peace in a way the person writing the first chapter was not. Not because fortune reversed, but because his understanding of where his true good was located had changed completely. He no longer needed the wheel to turn in his favor because he had come to understand it with a clarity that cost him everything to reach, that what he most needed had never been fortunes to give or take in the first place. Chapter 8. Stepping off the wheel. What it actually looks like in your real life. This is the chapter I most want you to actually use, not just absorb intellectually, not just find moving. Actually use in the specific life you're navigating right now, with its specific challenges and specific patterns and specific version of the wheel you're currently on. Because here's the truth. The teaching we've been building across these 8 chapters is easy to receive as inspiration and considerably harder to practice as daily reality. And there's no point in a 7-chapter philosophical arc that ends with a vague instruction to find inner peace. That's not a teaching, that's a fortune cookie. So let's get specific. Stepping off the wheel does not mean leaving your life. It does not mean withdrawing from ambition. It does not mean pretending you don't care about outcomes. It does not mean affecting a spiritual detachment that is, if we're honest, usually just avoidance wearing enlightenment's clothing. A person who interprets this teaching as a call to disengage from life has misunderstood it as completely as a person who interprets it as a promise that wisdom will make the wheel stop turning. What is actually being offered? In Boethius's philosophical conclusion, in the Vedic tradition's disciplines, in the Stoic practices, in the Buddhist teachings on non-attachment, is a specific and learnable shift in the location of identity. A shift from the rim of the wheel, where your sense of self is built from and dependent upon your current circumstances, to the axle, where your sense of self rests in something that your circumstances can influence but never actually destroy. This shift doesn't remove you from the wheel's motion. It changes what that motion can do to you while you remain fully, actively engaged within it. There are 3 concrete, practicable disciplines that recur consistently across the accounts of people who have made genuine progress toward this shift. Not perfect mastery. The records and the traditions are uniformly honest that complete mastery is vanishingly rare, but real working progress that measurably changes how a life is actually lived. The first discipline is what I call the practice of the witness. It is the deliberate, repeated act of pausing, in both triumph and disaster, to ask a single specific question. Who is the one experiencing this? Not in a way that distances you from the feeling, not in a way that intellectualizes you out of your own experience, but a genuine moment of noticing the noticer, the constant, quiet presence that has been observing every state you've passed through, every emotion you felt, every identity you've inhabited and shed across the years of your life. That presence has been there throughout. It was there before you had the job, before the relationship, before the success or the failure. It will be there after. It's the thing that knows you've been sad rather than being sadness itself. It's the thing that notices the fear without being consumed by the fear. Boethius performs a version of this throughout his dialogue, repeatedly stepping back from his immediate despair to examine it from a slightly higher vantage point. Not to escape the feeling, but to refuse to let the feeling be the entirety of his identity. In practice, this looks like small, regular moments of genuine self-observation. Not elaborate meditation retreats necessarily, a few minutes in the morning before the day's demands arrive. A pause before you react to something difficult. The simple habit of asking in the middle of both good and hard moments, what is noticing this? What is the constant underneath the variable? Done consistently across months and years, this single practice does more to shift identity from rim to axle than almost anything else available to a person engaged in ordinary life. The second discipline is what I'd call the open hand. It's the practice of engaging fully with your current position on the wheel, building it, enjoying it, caring about it, investing in it with complete presence, while simultaneously refusing to fuse your sense of self so completely to that position that its loss would feel like the loss of you. The easiest way to understand this is through its opposite. A person gripping their current summit with a clenched fist spends enormous unconscious energy defending the position against the possibility of loss. Energy that, paradoxically, tends to worsen the very decisions it was trying to protect. A person defending from fear tends to make worse choices than a person engaging from genuine presence. The open hand means holding the position fully, both hands on the work, complete attention, real care, while somewhere beneath that full engagement there's a quiet and settled awareness that the position, like every position before it, will eventually change, that this too, like everything before it, is temporary, and that the temporariness is not a threat to your identity, because your identity was never located only in the position. This is not about caring less, it's about caring from a more stable place. Think of how a skilled sailor handles a ship in rough water, fully engaged, hands on the wheel, complete attention, every sense alert, but not rigid, never fighting the water as though stillness were an option, because it isn't. The sailor who fights the water exhausts themselves and loses control anyway. The sailor who works with the water, responsive, present, adaptable, does significantly better. That's the open hand. Full engagement, without the grip that turns engagement into desperation. The third discipline is what I'd call service as ballast. This one sounds the most unlike the others, and I want to explain the connection precisely because it's the most practically powerful of the three. Service as ballast is the practice of directing whatever position you occupy on the wheel, summit or descent, abundant season or scarce one, toward the genuine benefit of others, rather than solely toward the shoring up of your own security. Here's why this matters for your stability, rather than just your moral credentials. A person whose identity is invested primarily in what they can give tends to experience far less catastrophic disruption when their own position on the wheel changes, because their sense of purpose, the meaning they were drawing from their current summit, was never located solely in what they were receiving from it. A person who has built real financial success and directed significant portions of that success toward genuinely helping others experiences the loss of that financial success very differently than a person who was hoarding it purely for personal security. Not because the loss is smaller, but because the first person's deepest sense of meaning, the meaning derived from having been useful, from having contributed something real, from having eased genuine suffering or built something that outlasts the immediate circumstance, survives the loss of the wealth entirely intact. Boethius himself spent much of his career and considerable resources funding the education of others, translating Greek philosophy into Latin specifically so that the wisdom of the ancient world would remain accessible after Rome's collapse. The wheel took his life. It could not touch what he had already given away. Whatever you build, whatever you accumulate, whatever position you reach, the portion of it you genuinely give away is the portion the wheel cannot take back, because you no longer have it to lose. These three disciplines, the witness, the open hand, and service as ballast, don't produce a person who no longer feels the wheel turning. They produce someone for whom the turning no longer determines the deepest layer of their peace. And this is the distinction that matters most, the one that separates genuine integration from mere numbness. A numb person doesn't feel the turning because they've gone to sleep, withdrawn their full presence from life in order to avoid the pain of eventual loss. A genuinely grounded person feels the turning completely, grieves losses honestly, celebrates gains fully, is moved by what deserves to move them, and yet remains beneath all of that full feeling, anchored to something the turning cannot reach. The difference is not the absence of feeling, it's the presence, underneath the feeling, of an unshakable ground. You will find versions of these three disciplines named independently across the traditions this entire teaching has drawn from. The Vedic concept of Sakshi Bhava, witness consciousness, cultivated through meditation as the antidote to over-identification with passing states. The Stoic discipline of amor fati, love of one's fate, meeting whatever arrives with the same steady engagement. The Bhagavad Gita's teaching on action without attachment to outcomes. Act fully and release your grip on the fruit of the action, because the fruit was never the point of planting the tree. Different vocabularies, same discovery. Closing, you were always the axle. We've traveled a long distance in these 8 chapters, from a Roman philosopher in a prison cell to the patterns in your own life, from the 4 counterfeits to the single destination underneath them, from the law of impermanence to the specific practices that make it something you can actually work with rather than simply survive. Let me bring it back to where we started. There is a wheel turning in your life right now. Maybe it's lifting you, a season of momentum, of things clicking into place, of the work paying off in visible ways. Maybe it's descending, a chapter of loss or confusion or the particular grief of something you built coming undone. Maybe it's simply turning in ways you can't quite see yet, but you sense something shifting. Whatever position you're currently occupying, you are not the position. You have never been the position. Not the one you're proud of, not the one you're ashamed of, not the one you're working toward, not the one you're afraid of losing. None of the positions on the circumference of the wheel are you. You are the awareness that has been watching every position, the constant underneath every variable, the presence that was there before the success and remained there after the failure, the thing that is capable right now of reading these words and recognizing something in them. That recognition itself, that sense of, yes, this is true, arriving quietly somewhere beneath the noise of your ordinary day. That's the axle. That's always been the axle. And the wheel, with all its turning, all its rises and falls, all the things it has given you and taken from you across the years of your specific life, has been doing one thing consistently this whole time. It's been teaching you to find your way back to the center, not by escaping your circumstances, by meeting them so fully, so honestly, with such genuine presence. The grief, the joy, the confusion, the clarity, that gradually, turn by turn, the positions stop being you and start being yours. things you move through, things you experience, things you learn from, things you occasionally lose and more occasionally gain, but never the source, never the foundation. The ancient philosophers called this wisdom. The contemplative traditions called it liberation. Modern psychology calls it psychological flexibility, the capacity to hold even the most difficult experiences without being permanently defined by them. I call it the only thing that was ever actually yours. The wheel will keep turning. The positions will keep changing. Some turns will feel like gifts, and some will feel like punishment. And the teaching says, across 15 centuries of people who have lived through both, that none of that changes the fundamental fact underneath it. You were never on the wheel. You were always the axle. And it's from there, from that still, unmoving, unkillable center, that your actual life is available to be lived.